Hey guys, welcome back. So now we're jumping into Jed MacKay's Moon Knight series, which we've been referencing for a while now. So I figured we'd go ahead and start a playlist so that now we can have a place where all these references are pointing to. But also I wanted to talk more about Moon Knight and some of the recent changes that have been taking place, especially now with Khonshu locked away and Moon Knight keeping his seat warm, so to speak. So let's get into it. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week. And don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squat up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so prior to this point, we talked about some of the recent appearances of Moon Knight, whether in Death of Doctor Strange or Devil's Reign, where we've kinda got the gist of what he's doing with the Midnight Mission, with him establishing himself as a priest and selecting a portion of New York as a safe haven for those who may need his help. But it's here in Jed MacKay's series where we find out that it's a lot deeper than that, because it's here where we find Mark Spector, who at this point in time is in the persona of Mr. Knight, who I would say is like your fifth persona of Mark Spector, and even though we've seen a ton of them, but aside from his core identities, we first have the mercenary Mark Spector, then your cab driver Jake Lockley, and your millionaire Stephen Grant, and usually your fourth after that would just be considered Moon Knight. And in most cases, people will consolidate your Mr. Knight and your vigilante-esque Moon Knight as one identity, but I've always considered them to be two. And the main reason I say this is because I want you to kind of hold on to this idea of how this system of different identities works, which I'm mostly referencing from Jeff Lemire's run. Because out of these five that I'm talking about, you have one, Mark Spector, the mercenary, and the real and true identity. And second, you got Stephen Grant, who we've seen as the millionaire, the actor, who alongside with number three, Jake Lockley, the cab driver, these were like these identities that Mark would use as alter egos before Lemire brought us to the idea of Mark being all of these people. And when we saw him accept that, he had also gained a bit of freedom. But then with number four, you have your traditional Moon Knight, the Fist of Khonshu and the Defender. But then on top of this, when it comes to Mr. Knight, I've always seen him as a fifth with a bit of an asterisk on it. Because with Mr. Knight, who effectively is Mark Spector, but in the role of Mr. Knight in Jeff Lemire's run, and this was shown best when we seen Mark step into the role of embracing these different identities in order to make him whole again. Which is why for me, and especially in this new run by Jed MacKay, where we see Mark Spector in the white suit, referring to himself as both Mark and Mr. Knight, that is not only your core number one first identity Mark Spector, but Mr. Knight is the version of Mark Spector who's leaned into the madness, embraced who he is, and it's because of this version that all the other versions of himself are in line. And even more so now with Khonshu locked away and out of the picture, in this second version of Mark Spector, in Khonshu's absence, he decides how he wants to run the show. And that's mainly why I separate Mr. Knight as a fifth, with an asterisk. But don't worry, as we have our different discussions, we'll definitely revisit this idea. But it's here early on where we're thrown into some of the early stages of what the Midnight Mission is, where we see Moon Knight stopping this van that's full of a bunch of regular people who have been turned into vampires against their will, and with them being taken while this van is en route, it passes through Moon Knight's territory. And with the way that this introduction is done, like on a full moon where Moon Knight just swoops in and he totally wrecks this van because he's ridiculously stronger in the full moon. But as far as the way that he confronts these first two, the driver and the guy in the passenger seat, who are both clearly vampires, and for me it's the way that he tells them, my warning was the sign that you passed. I paint my symbol on the wall so people know that they're safe here. But he more or less just tells them that that was their warning. Like, he just stakes the both of them, and it's ashes to ashes, dust to dust. But with them getting to the others who were taken in this van, they quickly plead for their lives like, hey, we didn't ask for this. We're not killers, they took us and made us this way. And with hearing this, Moon Knight let them live, and he let them go, with the exception of one, who's a young lady by the name of Reese, who chose to help Moon Knight and his cause with the Midnight Mission, because initially in her case, she really didn't have anywhere else to go. But then it's here where we see that Mark's in a therapy session to where he's telling back this story to Dr. Sturman, to whom on her end she was requested by the Avengers to give these therapy sessions to Mark after the whole Age of Khonshu thing with Khonshu trying to take over the world. And you can tell initially in this session, Dr. Sturman, she's trying to ease Mark into things with going over his history, saying he was US Marine Corps, ex-CIA, private military. But early on you could tell that Mark, he doesn't want to sugarcoat things, but rather he just wants to call it what it is, as far as the quote-unquote private military contracting, because really and truly he was a mercenary, so it's kind of like, let's just call a spade a spade. But then it's here where Dr. Sturman asks Mark about his trip to Sudan with Raoul Bushman, when at the time, in her words, he grew a conscience and had turned against his fellow mercenary, when at the time was the course of events that had led to his first death. And it's not so much the case at this point where Dr. Sturman doesn't believe Mark, but it's more so like she's running down the list and observing his response to the events that had occurred in his past, and really just observing how he's responding to it now. And in a way, Mark kinda does this dance with her, because as she goes through with the events in Sudan and she gets to the part to where he died, his immediate response is like, "You're right, I did grow a conscience." But then he goes on to express on how the events leading up to his death, with all the dirt that he had done, how it had left his soul like a barren earth. In order for something to sprout or grow from it, that barren earth had to be watered with his blood. And with him saying this, in a way, it's almost like he's expressing that when he died and he was resurrected by Khonshu, that this is something that was necessary. And even to go as far as his terms with Khonshu, to where the deal was for Mark to come back to life, he would have to become the fist of Khonshu. But now with Khonshu out of the picture, for the foreseeable future at least, Mark believes that he's inherited Khonshu's duty. Because regardless of Khonshu try to take over the world, Mark is still his fist, and the duty of Khonshu is now his debt, which is something we take a bit of a deeper look into in just a little bit. But then it's here where we see at the midnight mission, where Mark's approached by an elderly lady, and she's telling him about these things that come out to his building at night. They scratch on the doors, they're whispering all sorts of things, and the people in their building are frightened. And Mark pretty much says, "Don't worry about it, I'll handle it." And it's from here where we see Mark go from Mr. Knight to Moon Knight to make his way to her building and handle this situation, which again goes back to what I mentioned about Mr. Knight being like your fifth identity and Moon Knight the fist being the fourth. And even though we've seen your Mr. Knight suit and tie Mark Spector get his hands dirty a number of times, and when either one of these two show up, either one of them are ready to brawl, whether it be the defender or the mercenary who grew a conscience. But by all means, when we see him suit up as the defender, who's now on the same page with your current Mr. Knight Mark Spector in the midnight mission, and it's here where he's ready to just destroy anyone or anything that steps into his territory, which he's marked with his insignia, and attempts to pose a threat to his people. But with him getting here, he realizes that he's run into Vermin, who's one of Spider-Man's villains, who hates being alone, so Vermin cloned himself so he wouldn't be alone. And it's here where Moon Knight tells Vermin like, "Hey, I'm not Spider-Man. I will kill every last one of you and end this here." But through the course of this, we jump back and forth to the therapy session, to where with how this is done, I really like how Jed McKay even opened this whole thing up with Mark introducing himself as Mr. Knight, to really let us know who exactly is in therapy right now. Because if any of the identities, this is the one that should be, because he's the one who's best suited to speak for Mark as a whole. Because for her, after asking Mark if he can die, to where Mark responded he doesn't know, to where from there they then began to dig deeper into the logic in Mark's current standing with Khonshu. And it's here where he makes his stand and his connection very clear. Although the logic of it all may be questionable, but when it's all said and done, Mark's perspective, it makes sense. Because regardless of how you want to look at Khonshu, with him trying to take over the world, and whether anyone thinks he's a worthy god or not, but at the end of the day, Mark Spector is the fist of Khonshu. Khonshu effectively brought him back to life. And even though he may be a high priest estranged from his god, but in Khonshu's absence, his duty is now Mark's debt. And that's why Mark has decided with the Midnight Mission to take on Khonshu's duty as his own. And with this happening, there are a couple things that kind of fly under the radar with this. Because for one, this is Mr. Knight Mark Spector's logic, as far as Khonshu being gone and him having to step up. But also with him bringing in Reese as his receptionist, who we had seen earlier as one of the civilians in the van, who was turned into a vampire against her will, but with their choosing to help Mark with this mission, taking up the role of the receptionist. But with doing so, you have these moments to where he asks her to get a cup of coffee, and initially she's kind of like, "No, you can get it yourself." And in some ways, it just kind of reminds me of the dynamic between Mark and Khonshu, with him making his decision to get on board. But then you have moments much like this one, to where Mark, he's very faithful to Khonshu, but at the same time, he's executing his loyalty the way that he believes that it should be done, which is also something we go a bit deeper into, but later on in the series. But then after this, we jump over to Mark responding to a supervillain attacking a clinic, only to find out that it's 8-Ball. And it's not even like it's the original 8-Ball, Jeff Hagees, because at least his superpower was a gambling problem. But for Moon Knight, when he gets here and he finds the doctor of this clinic beating the mess out of this guy. But as Moon Knight speaks to this guy who introduces himself as Dr. Batter, and he quickly expresses that he had been looking forward to meeting Moon Knight, which is a little weird for him to hear because usually when somebody greets Moon Knight like that, shortly after they just start swinging on him. But the doctor lets him know that that's not the case because Mark Spector is a fist of Khonshu, and the doctor tells Moon Knight that as a fist of Khonshu, he has a sacred duty. But for Moon Knight, with hearing this and kind of having the first impression that this guy has some level of reverence for Khonshu, and right away it causes him to ask the doctor why he hasn't seen him at the church social. But when the doctor expresses that he's new in town, and to keep it simple, Dr. Batter tells him just think of me as someone from home office who's recently come into town and is disappointed with what he sees. Because at this current time, with Mark's god being in the custody of other deities, but instead of doing anything about it, he's here making a home for vampires in an area that's consecrated to the duty of Khonshu, which the doctor finds rather blasphemous. And so it's here where Moon Knight pretty much tells him like, okay buddy, like wherever you land on the hierarchy, I'm pretty sure you're under me, because again, he's the fist of Khonshu. But with ending this conversation, the doctor just lets him know that only one person outranks him, and that person is not Mark Spector. But then after this, we then go to another conversation between Mr. Knight and Dr. Sturman, to where it's here where she expresses her concern for Mark, or more specifically her concern for his mind, because even the MRI scans show that his brain structure, it's been fundamentally changed with him being in brain-to-brain contact with Khonshu. And with her giving him the example of Caedmon, who's one of the earliest known English poets, who had received a dream from an angel or a messenger who had asked him to sing a hymn, and after that encounter when Caedmon had woken up, from then forward he just had this extraordinary talent. Like from there he was a changed man. And it's here where Dr. Sturman tells Mark that she's not only concerned about the changes that Mark has been through, but also the changes that he may yet have ahead of him. But then it's like from here we then jump forward to where Mark has made his way back to the Midnight Mission, to where at this time Reese has brought him a cup of coffee, and once again it's here where I can't help but to think of Reese kind of being this example of what Mark has been to Khonshu up to this point. Because even when you take those moments where we've seen Mark and Khonshu at odds, but if you zoom out and look at the big picture over the years, Mark has always figuratively reverted back to bringing Khonshu that cup of coffee. Even though in this case Reese more or less tells him that she brought it because she bought it for herself, but she forgot she was a vampire and that's why she brought it to him. But even still, with seeing this, I feel like there's a bit of a parallel going on here. But also aside from this, you then had this moment to where Mark expresses to Reese that the thing that he likes about her is that she doesn't try to fix him. Because for Mark, it's hard enough when the world thinks you're crazy, but then on top of that, it's even tougher when they're actually right. But then it's also here where we see that Mark and Reese are being watched from across the street by a shadowy figure who we come to find out who it is later on in the series. But it's here where he's posted up with like the 5 identities of Mark Spector, and he talks about how Mark Spector has got so much potential, but instead of Mark going in that direction, he believes that Mark is using the Midnight Mission and his sacred duty as a crutch. And for that reason, this person has every intention on crushing Mark and breaking his faith to the point where he believes in nothing. But also with doing this guy believes that with breaking Mark down to nothing, that it's at that point that we'll see who Mark really is. But then after that, we then go back to Dr. Batter as he makes his way home, and it's here where we get more of the details of what he meant with him saying that he was someone from home office, as well as there being one person above him and that person not being Mark. And it's here where we find that Dr. Batter is the left fist of Khonshu, and from his perspective, Moon Knight requires correction. He's wandered off the path, he's strayed from his faith, and he's failed Khonshu as the right hand, but for Dr. Batter as the left hand, he hasn't, and he plans to get Mark Spector back in line by any means necessary. And so now real quick, I want to give a special shout out to all the patrons. Thank you guys for all of your support, and for anyone who's new here who wants more information on how to support the channel, I got a link below so you can go to patreon.com/dopespill. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and we'll do it again on the next one. Alright, later.